You can kick them off.
Okay.
Get going.
So thank you guys all for joining us today for the Economic Development Committee meeting. I've been out of town for a couple weeks, so I'm just getting back caught up. I appreciate, Miles, you setting this up. So I'll talk about it a little bit more at the end, but I am still looking for any kind of input on direction for the committee if there's certain things you guys want to get accomplished. I don't think I didn't share the story about Ed Case and the HSTA last time, did I? Okay, so anyway, I was listening to the radio about a month ago, and the head of the HSTA was talking about how they were supporting the opponent of Ed Case. And full disclosure, Ed Case is my second cousin. But the thing that I couldn't understand was they didn't like Ed Case because he was pro-business. And I was trying to figure out going, wait a second, if you work for the HSTA, you get your income from the government, and the government gets their income from businesses, and people who work for businesses paying taxes. So where do you think the money comes from? It just magically appears? I don't know. Anyway, so that's the kind of thing we got to push our politicians or any people. Just how can we help small business survive when people think that they're not even worth anything, I guess. Anyway, so ideas are always helpful and useful. That being said, today we are lucky enough to get a presentation regarding the employee retention credit. And I must say, as an employee of Edward Jones, I am not super familiar with this because I am not a small, I mean, I'm sort of like a small business owner, but I'm an employee rather than running everything that the business does. But Steve Seto, the Vice President of Marketing with ProService Hawaii, is going to help us get some insights on this. And Steve, you want to introduce Joan or you want me to?
I'd be happy to.
Okay.
Thank you, Keith.
Okay, appreciate you. Thanks for coming on today.
Well, thank you to all of you for having us here and for giving us this opportunity to continue to spread the word, building on what Keith just said. Government got it right during the CARES Act and during the pandemic of 2020 and 2021. I think everybody's familiar with PPP. Just by a show of hands, who of you has even heard of this thing called the ERC, the Employee Retention Credit? So a couple people. So you're not alone. This is an incredibly generous government program that is free money that the vast majority of employers do qualify for. And the filing deadline is still open. And so if we leave you with one message today, we're hoping that you will advocate within your own organizations and certainly with the many organizations that you influence and you network with to encourage all employers to give this a real serious look. Because, anytime money is needed and valuable, but especially in these times where employers are just, it's brutal. Between inflation and the rising cost of business on every single expense line item, combined with the short staffing challenges. And this is one of those it can't be true, but it actually is programs that is free money for employers that put the work into it. I'll also say it is, in our opinion, the government's most complicated and least understood pandemic relief program out there. So with that, why don't I'm happy to do introductions before we go to the actual presentation. So first of all, I am so excited to introduce you to ProService's, what I call our ERC Dream Team. I don't know if any of you have heard of ProService or what you do know about it. Usually when I talk to people, they're like, oh, ProService, you guys do payroll, yeah? Or you guys have good rates on insurance, and none of that's wrong. That's all right. But we support and actually run HR, depending on the company size, for 2,600 employers in the state of Hawaii, many of them on the Big Island, for-profit and not-for-profit organizations. And collectively, our clients employ close to 50,000 worksite employees. And so anytime there is anything important dealing with helping employers care for their people better, whether it's compensation, performance management, hiring and retention, and certainly the payroll and the funding side, we try to be all over it and support them. So I'm pleased to introduce our ERC Dreamtime. They have literally been working on this together for 2 years now. So first, Joan Fujita. She's a principal at Acuity, one of our state's largest CPA and consulting firms. And Joan leads the tax consulting group at Acuity. Next, Iqbal Ashraf. Iqbal has been with ProService for many years, working on a number of these special strategic projects. And he and Joan were really 2 of the 5 people or so on the ProService team that put this together and put together what we believe is the best ERC program in the state. And actually, we think it competes with most of them across the country. And we'll show you some of the evidence of that in a minute. I'd also like to introduce, who was already kind of introduced, Chris Keahi Olalo, a good old Hilo boy. And he is one of my partners in crime on the sales and marketing team. So with that, Taylor, why don't we open up the presentation and welcome everybody else. Okay, so yes, so this is what we're gonna go through, a lot of the basics, and importantly, as you advocate within your own organizations and with those that you coach, we'll leave you with some thoughts on how to select an ERC provider and how to manage them to ensure that they're really doing the best job for you. I apologize, I forgot to introduce Amber Mullis, also from Acuity. Amber is a tax supervisor within Joan's organization and one of the many, many people that has worked on hundreds of applications and more importantly, spent a lot of time consulting to clients such that employers really understand their rights and the value that they can get from this program. So thank you all for joining us today, Amber. Okay, Taylor, let's go to the next slide. So what is the ERC? For short, it stands for the Employee Retention Credit. In short, the way that I think about this is, in addition to PPP, which I think everybody's heard of, it is an incredibly generous program that the government put together in 2020 and then kept changing in 2021 as a lot of the CARES programs went, that offers free money for employers that did the hard work of keeping their employees on their own payroll and importantly off of the uninsurance rolls. And as you know, back in 2020 and 2020, it was hard to pay your own employees, right? And the government acknowledges that, and they're saying, in addition to PPP, incremental to PPP, we are making this other program available to you called ERC. The vast majority of employers of all organizations in Hawaii do qualify, but most people don't realize that. And/or honestly, it's so complicated that often when employers have gone to their advisors, the advisor said you don't qualify because you cannot double dip. You already got PPP. The truth is you cannot double dip, but the way the programs are set up, most employers qualify for both PPP and ERC because you count the labor hours differently. And you know, the Hawaii Chamber is an excellent example. You know, Miles was telling me how the Chamber has such excellent counsel from a lot of the board members in the finance committee that way back when the finance committee went to Miles and said, like, look, you need to apply for ERC. And Miles, you were telling me how you were successful in both getting forgiveness on your PPP and also an ERC credit. So that's great. They are no obligation, free funds. These are not loans, free funds for up to $26,000 per employee. And we'll get into the specifics of how you qualify and how much actually pays out. It's up to. It takes the form of a payroll credit, so the government does not write you a check, so it's not short-term cash flow, but it does take the form of a payroll credit, which of course does help with cash flow a little bit further down the road. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So what we're doing is sharing with you our actual evidence of what we've processed thus far. So this is ProService alone. In addition to this, Acuity has processed a whole bunch of applications too. But just within our own client base, we have already submitted 574 client applications for the ERC, totaling over $89 million in credit. So again, it can be substantial. And we just want to make sure that as much of this available money comes to our state to help our state economy and our state employers. What also I think is interesting is often when we talk to people who know a little bit about it, they say like, oh, I probably don't qualify because I was an essential business, and clearly essential businesses don't qualify. The truth is, again, almost all businesses qualify because of the generous criteria that the government put in place. So food and beverage and hospitality appear in the right hand, the like 1 and 2 o'clock on this. That makes sense because they were shut down for long periods of time, and that makes sense to us, right? But you look at essential businesses like construction or health and education, transportation, distribution, and wholesale. A lot of these businesses were functioning throughout the pandemic. They were essential businesses. If they were shut down at all, it was only for a minor period, and they're all qualifying. And toward the end, Iqbal will take you through some case studies that actually show some of these surprising situations and how much money they were able to receive across all the different government pandemic relief programs. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please, Taylor. This, we're not going to spend a lot of time, but this just to give you, because of course people are saying, okay, is it going to be worth my time? It sounds like a lot of effort. And how much could the dollars be? Averages, I think, are often misleading because, as you're going to learn, it all depends on your unique situation. But this chart starts giving you some indication of the type of money involved. And I think what is particularly interesting is as you start looking at the PPP dollars involved, especially for larger employers, those with 50 or more employees, you start seeing, wow, the ERC funds can actually be equal to or even more than the PPP dollars that they receive in terms of forgiven dollars. So when you kind of compare, just imagine like, wow, you could get a lot more money from this. Okay, let's keep going. So let's talk first about how do you qualify? And with that, I would like to hand it over to our partner, Joan.
Okay, I'm going to go over how your business qualifies, and there's many ways to do that. So if I could have you go to the next slide. It's sort of a step-by-step. So I would say the first step in the process, in the qualification process, is to determine if you're a large employer or a small employer. And I know for most Hawaii businesses, right, we're small employers because we have less than 100 or 500 employees, but I just wanted to explain what this threshold means. So if you are a small employer, all you have to do is pay payroll during the pandemic. For large employers, they make it a little bit harder. Large employers have to pay employees to not work. So for example, they have to furlough them, but still pay them. So if like in Hawaii, most of us are small businesses, so it's easier to qualify because if we were under 100 employees or less in 2020, or 500 employees or less in 2021, we're considered a small employer. And therefore, as long as we paid employees, we would meet this threshold and qualify under this first process. One thing I wanted to point out, which, you know, a lot of mainland companies will come in, consultants, and say, oh, let me help you with ERC, right? Let's look at your business. Let's look at how many employees you have. Let's look at your payroll costs. Okay, you qualify. What they might fail to do is look at these qualification tests on an affiliated group basis. That means you as a business owner might have several different businesses. If you control them, and it's sort of a complicated mathematical formula, which we would go through, you know, if you control 2 out of the 3 businesses, what the rules say is you have to aggregate, you know, the number of employees in those 2 businesses in the affiliated group that you control. So it's easy to quantify this, right? But the difficult part is knowing which companies to include in your quantification. If anyone has questions, feel free to stop me, put something in the chat, as some of these rules may not be that straightforward. Okay, if I could go on to the next slide. Okay, so once you've determined if you're a large or small employer, The next step in qualification is to look to see whether you had a significant decline in gross receipts or a full or partial suspension of your business operations. It's easiest to qualify under the significant decline in gross receipts because it's a pure mathematical test. What the definition of significant decline is you look at it on a quarterly basis, a calendar quarter basis. So for example, fourth quarter of 2020 would be October, November, December, regardless of what your accounting or tax year end is. So you would look at your gross receipts for the fourth quarter of 2020, for example, compare it to the same quarter in 2019, fourth quarter 2019. If your gross receipts declined by 50% or more, you would qualify for the credit for that quarter. 2021, much easier to qualify. The government said, same test, you compare 2021 gross receipts for a particular quarter to the same quarter in 2019, right? So the base is 2019, the last year where business operated as usual. If you achieved a 20% or more decline, then you qualify, right? So much easier to qualify in 2021. And by the way, the credit amount is increased for 2021. So most people focus on 2021. So that's the decline in gross receipts test. I also wanted to point out that gross receipts, I think actually we have a slide coming up on what gross receipts means, like how you count it, right? Because there's so many different ways to count gross receipts. The full or partial suspension test, like let's say certain businesses were essential businesses, so they didn't have that significant decline in gross receipts. And that's where I think a lot of businesses stop and say, oh, I don't qualify, let's move on. What they don't realize is they could still qualify under a full or partial suspension of operations. And in this situation, this is anytime that there was a government order that limited operations. So for example, at the very beginning of the pandemic, there was that, I want to say it was like a 2-week period around Easter where Governor Ige said the whole state has to shut down, right? So businesses couldn't operate, employees couldn't work, you couldn't go in unless you're an essential business. And so if you were required to shut down under a government order, then you may qualify under this full or partial suspension test. There's also, which we'll cover in another slide, a definition of maybe your whole business wasn't required to shut down, but a portion was. And a common example would be, for example, restaurants. Restaurants could still do takeout, but they couldn't have dine-in. So that was like a partial suspension that was ordered by the government. So the key thing qualifying under this suspension test is that the government had to issue something that required your business to shut down or change how you operate. And for Hawaii Island, it would be, it could have been a government order issued by the mayor. It could be something issued by Governor Ige that applied to the whole state, but it's based on county rules, right? So you would have to look on the government website and look under the government orders for the specific county that the business is in. And if you have several locations, like we had some clients that had operations on Oahu and on Maui, right? So we had to pull the government orders for the 2 different locations. So 2 ways to qualify under this test. Any questions? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so here's when Steve was mentioning that the credit is very generous, like the guidance and the rules are also interpreted very generously, and there's a lot of exceptions. So what the government wants you to qualify, right? They want to give away this credit. So what they did, for example, is they gave you 2 ways to qualify under the decline in gross receipts test. So if you look at the top those bars, right? We would be comparing the gross receipts for example, quarter 3 of 2021 to quarter 3 of 2019, right? If you met the more than 20% decline for that quarter comparison, you would qualify under that gross receipts decline test. What they're also doing is saying you can qualify for the quarter 3, even though you might not have met the 20% test, if you qualify for the preceding quarter. So going back to quarter 2, comparing gross receipts, quarter 2 2021 to quarter 2 2019, you met the test, 20% decline, great, you're eligible for the credit in quarter 2. Guess what? You're also eligible under the guidance for the credit in quarter 3. So the IRS is trying to make it easier for you to qualify for more periods to claim the credit. So this is like a little nuance that some people might not be aware of. They may just look at the particular quarter to qualify, but in 2021, you can also look at the preceding quarter. Any questions? Otherwise, next slide. Okay, this slide, how does my business qualify for a government suspension? And the point here is the suspension could either be a full suspension where they mandate that certain businesses shut down for a period of time, or it could be a partial suspension. And the thing to note here is, if there is a government suspension, only the payroll paid during that suspended period will qualify for the credit. Under the decline in gross receipts test, if you qualify for the quarter, all your payroll in that quarter is eligible for the credit. If you qualify under the suspension test, so for example, let's say out of April, May, June, the government required your specific type of business to shut down for the month of April. So 1/3 of the time you qualify under government suspension, only 1/3 of the payroll would be eligible for the credit. Under the partial suspension test, if you meet certain hurdles, if you exceed certain hurdles, then all of your payroll would qualify. So it is definitely more advantageous and easier to qualify under the gross receipts decline test, right? It's mathematical, the whole quarter qualifies, but don't give up if you don't meet that test, because you should do the work to figure out if you qualify under government suspension and determine how much of your payroll for that particular quarter would qualify. Any questions on this point? Otherwise, we'll move on to the next slide. So here, I think we just wanted to give some examples of what a partial business suspension looks like to show that, even if you don't meet the decline in gross receipts test, don't give up, because these examples show that, a lot of the businesses in Hawaii would qualify under this partial business suspension test. So the first category on the left, the nominal portion of the business was suspended, right? So only a part of it was suspended. And again, the most common scenario we've seen is with the restaurants, right? Restaurants could not have people walking in and dining in person, but they could do takeout or delivery. So that's a portion of their business that was suspended. So they should go through the rules, take the time, figure out, which quarters they qualify and claim the credit. Similar for retail stores, for a while, like I know Ala Moana was shut down, but people were able to do online sales, right? So the in-person portion of the business was suspended, but it's not like the whole business was shut down. In the second category, there are some restrictions on how businesses would operate. Like maybe they weren't shut down, but there were government guidelines on how they could operate. So for example, the tourism industry, certain operators could still offer their tours, but because of the social distancing rules, they have to have less number of people, maybe on the trolley doing the tour. And so their operations were limited. Similarly, hair salons, they have to, I don't know if you guys, have the shower curtain or the dividers when you went to get your haircut. They couldn't have all the chairs filled, right? Like every other chair could be filled. Salons, if people go to salons, they couldn't do facials because they couldn't remove the face mask, but they could maybe do pedicures. So things like that, the government would limit how they operate, right? That would qualify under this partial business suspension. And then the last one is if there was a suspension at a critical supplier that prevented your business from operating. So for example, if you needed supplies inventory from someone else in order to continue your business and service your clients, but you couldn't get that supply, right? Then that limited your business. And under this test, you could qualify under the partial business suspension. So it's really factual, it's different for each type of business. And that's why we say it will take a little bit more work to qualify under this suspension test, but definitely worth it because once you qualify, the benefits, right, you saw the credit amounts. So it's definitely worth it to go through this analysis. Any questions on this? Okay, next slide. So just some caveats of what does not qualify. So some people, might say, oh, well, I was not able to make as much money. Let's say they had an 18% decline in gross receipts, right? They didn't meet the 20%, so they didn't qualify under that. But their argument is, well, my customers didn't come, right? So I should be eligible for the credit. Unfortunately, the IRS guidance says that lack of demand, due to a stay-at-home order, the government said people couldn't go out, so people didn't come to your restaurant, they didn't come to your store. Lack of demand is not a valid way to qualify for the credit. Also, some businesses might have just voluntarily suspended their operations. The government didn't say they have to shut down, but maybe they had a lot of high-risk employees that were in a high-risk group, right? So they just voluntarily shut down. That does not qualify them for the ERC, right? It had to be based on a government order. And then also businesses that pivoted, maybe they couldn't come into the office, but a lot of businesses, the employees were able to work at home. And so if they were able to pivot and replicate their normal business operations, via telecommuting and remote work, then that is not considered a hardship that will qualify them for the ERC. So it has to be either the decline in gross receipts or a suspension of operations by a government order. Any questions? I can't see everyone, but I assume if people have questions, feel free to just speak up.
I get one question. Oh, I get one question.
Sure.
Kevin Bolchin. So, like how you were saying that the effect on the businesses. Yeah. So let's just take, and I'll use an example, right? Hotels, right? At one point in time, hotels were not able to operate. So they didn't have people coming, but you had all the sub businesses that supplied their needs. Those businesses would be impacted. Does that qualify?
It would qualify if the sub businesses had a decline in gross receipts, which they probably did, right? Because if they weren't able, for example, like a food, like a food vendor, right, wasn't supplying the restaurants, so they weren't getting paid, they would be affected, but they probably would qualify under the 20% decline in gross receipts.
That's why you said use that one, right? Use that,
right,
that gross receipt one is the key. Okay.
Right.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Yeah, Joan, Keith Merrick, just quick question. So
Sure.
this all assumes that you kept people on payroll.
If you were a small employer, It's any payroll you paid. And we're actually going to go over the definition of payroll because there are some businesses who, they furloughed the workers, but they continue to pay health insurance.
Okay.
And health insurance is falls under the definition of payroll. So
Okay.
even those employers, right, like they couldn't pay their employees because they had no income, but because employers in Hawaii are they take care of their employees, a lot of them said, I'm sorry, we have to furlough you, but you know what? We're going to pay your health insurance for this time. And the cost of health insurance that the employer paid is qualified payroll for purposes of the credit.
Great.
Any other questions? Okay, we'll move on to the next section. So the next section is, what type of documentation you need to apply for the credit. So let's say you went through the test, you determined, gosh, I qualify under these rules and, for these quarters. Now, what is going to support your qualification and the actual credit amount? And this is really important because the ERC, it's a payroll tax refund. So under the normal rules, your payroll tax filing is subject to a 3-year statute of limitations, meaning that once you file it, the IRS has 3 years to come in, audit you, and make an adjustment. Because this credit is so generous, the IRS is saying we're going to take 5 years for our statute of limitations. So any payroll tax filing that claims the ERC will be subject to a 5-year statute of limitations. The IRS has 5 years after you file it to come in and audit. So it's really important that you have all the documentation in your file to support that you qualify, to support what you paid as payroll, to support the calculation. And I know ProService is very good about, obtaining and maintaining that documentation upfront, right? You could be audited 5 years from now, your payroll person could be gone, and then you're scrambling to try to support your qualification and credit amount. So that's why we wanted to talk about documentation. It's important because of the extended time period that the IRS has to audit this credit. Next slide. So documenting the decline in gross receipts. So here, the decline is a mathematical calculation, right? So you just need to show that calculation, a spreadsheet. But what is gross receipts? So gross receipts really is your receipts under your tax accounting method. So really your gross receipts that you're picking up on your income tax return. But in this case, you have to do it by quarter. So I think to estimate, whether they qualify, some companies were just taking their annual tax return gross receipts, dividing by 4, and, figuring out, okay, that's my gross receipts for the quarter. Let's compare it to 2019. But, really you should do a quarterly cutoff to see, because a lot of businesses, they're seasonal, right? So they may earn a lot of gross receipts, around the holidays or at other times during the year, depending on what type of business they are. So when they're low in a particular quarter, right, they are more likely to qualify in those quarters. So we really want people to look at their quarterly gross receipts. And one way to do this, I mean, obviously people's books and records, they may have that information. They need to convert it to an income tax basis. But the Hawaii GET return, is sort of a quick way to look. Most people file it on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis, and that might be a better way to figure out from a high level what the gross receipts are for the quarter. Any questions on that? I also wanted to mention that the PPP loan proceeds are not counted as gross receipts. So, a lot of our clients, when we first went to them, said, oh, well, I got a PPP loan, and therefore my gross receipts in 2021, were actually higher or the same as 2019. You do not have to count the PPP loan proceeds in your gross receipts. Okay, next slide. Documentation to qualify for full or partial suspension. So like I said before, the government suspension is based on the government orders. So if you look on the county website, the state website, you will see all of and I think it was at one time weekly, they would issue government orders, saying these businesses can be open from these hours. These businesses have to socially distance, right? So all those government orders are on some county or state website. It is very voluminous, which is why, a lot of times taxpayers want an advisor to help them go through, to help them qualify under this government suspension. And to give you an example, the Oahu County orders for 2020 were almost 700 pages. That's what we sifted through to help our clients qualify. The other thing you want to document is the start and end dates of your business suspension. So if you have a copy of that government order that says shut down on this date, you're allowed to reopen on this date, right? Then you have the exact days and you have support for that. Those government orders may not be on the website 5 years from now in the event you get audited. So you probably want to pull that and put it into your file. We'll go over some examples on the next slide of how you would document a partial suspension. The full suspension is easy because the government orders would just say shut down from this date to this date, right? It's a little more involved to document a partial suspension. So the key here is, the best documentation is not something that you have to create. It's something that you already have, right? Look to see what you already have and collect that data as support. The other key point here is that per the IRS guidance, they're saying a partial suspension, that gets you over the hurdle of qualifying is something that passes the 10% mark, right? And they don't necessarily define 10% of what. So this slide interprets, right, how you can get over that 10% hurdle. So for example, restaurants, right, we talked about there was a partial suspension because dine-in was suspending, even though takeout could still go on. If we can show somehow that the dine-in, the piece of the business that was partially suspended, somehow gets over a 10% hurdle, then we can qualify the taxpayer for the credit. So here, one of the examples was, we looked at the dine-in receipts for 2021 versus 2019, showed that there was a decline in receipts for that portion of the business that was more than 10%, right? And that's the way we're going to get over the hurdle. In the middle column, what we looked at is the number of appointments. So a dentist, might have had 300 appointments in a particular quarter. And then in 2021, maybe they only had, 250 appointments, which got them, there was 10% fewer appointments. And all they have to do is have their appointment log as the supporting documentation. The other ways that you can support the 10% hurdle, getting over the 10% hurdle. For example, we had people who pulled their employee schedule, right, to show that the number of hours scheduled for employees working declined more than 10%. So it really is unique to the type of business operation. But again, the key point here is pull from your normal routine data that you already have, right? You're not trying to create something to support your qualification. You're just trying to take whatever documentation that you already have, pull it into a file, show that you surpass the 10% hurdle. Any questions on this one? This one is very involved, but as we say, it's worth it because it could be worth right up to $26,000 per employee. And when you see the numbers, and I know Iqbal will go over more examples, it is definitely worth it, right, to go over this exercise with your advisor. The last slide that I wanted to go over is the calculation for the credit, how much your business could qualify. So if you could go to the next slide. So the credit amount, in 2020, is a 50% of wages credit. More generous in 2021, 70% of eligible wages. So 2020, there's a cap on eligible wages, $10,000, 50%, 10,000. That's where we get our maximum credit of 5,000 per employee for 2020. In 2021, they loosened the restrictions, gave a more generous credit. They said your cap on eligible payroll was 10,000 per quarter for the first 3 quarters, 70% credit rate, 7,000 per employee per quarter for the first 3 quarters. That's where we get the 21,000 cap for. There's some special rules for startups that they could get an additional $7,000. So that's where, the $26,000 max comes from. So definitely worth your while to go through both years, all quarters, all employees. On the right side, I wanted to talk a little bit about qualified wages, and I touched on this before, right? It's wages paid to employees. So for small employers, when you paid your employees to work, that qualifies. If you're over the hurdle, for example, we have some very large hotels that had more than 500 employees. They actually had to pay their employees not to work, right? But most of us are small businesses. As long as you pay your employees, those wages paid to the employees would qualify. There are some special rules for relatives, like if you were the owner of the business and paid your spouse, some of those wages wouldn't qualify. So that employee wouldn't qualify. But for the most part, wages paid to unrelated employees would qualify. The next item, medical and dental, I wanted to bring up because, like I mentioned before, some businesses could not afford to pay their employees. So they furloughed them, but they agreed to cover their medical and dental. So if you covered medical and dental, the employer portion of that falls into the bucket, the definition of wages against which you could claim the credit, right? So you want to pull that information. The next 3 items, where you have to subtract out of your wages are other COVID-related government programs, right? So like the biggest one, for example, if you got the PPP loan and you use that loan to pay wages, you cannot double dip, right? You've got to take those out of your wages for purposes of ERC. But most people, even after the PPP loan forgiveness, have excess wages, right? So you just have to take the time to find the numbers, separate that out, and not claim PPP wages here, but just claim the excess. And by now, it's easier. Before, people were guessing, they were anticipating, but now most people have filed their PPP loan forgiveness application. They know exactly what they claim for wages, and so they would easily know what the excess is. So you get down to your qualified wages. And then again, the credit is a 50% rate for 2020 wages and a 70% for 2021. Any questions on the calculation? Okay, if not, I'm going to hand off the next section. Iqbal is going to go over, I think, more of the examples and what we've seen over the last year and a half.
Thank you, Joan. So I'm just going to talk from our experience, meaning ProService experience with the filings so far. As Steve mentioned, 2,600 clients. So a whole, and we have filed for 570 plus now. So we had to do it in batches. We call them waves. So we are about to start our 8th wave of the filing, essentially. And it comes with some sense of urgency for us because there's a 3-year window to file for ERC. So whenever you do your quarterly payroll taxes, 3 years from then is the ERC window, and then it closes. So 2023 Q1 would be the last time somebody can do ERC for 2020 Q1 payroll. The first part of this slide is just a recap of what Joan was talking about. After you have qualified, what determines the amount of the credit is really your employee wages and the health insurance part. What period did you qualify for, whether based on gross receipt or shutdown, it doesn't matter at this point. The length of the period does matter. And then how much of the forgiven PPP funds were applied to wages. Government allows you to apply 100% to wages or apply up to 60% to wages. But whatever you apply to wages, you cannot double dip on that and ask for the same wage to be paid by ERC as well. So that's the first part. The other thing I wanted to mention was, there is a difference, there's a world of difference between being compliant to IRS in the ERC process and on being compliant as well as maximizing your refund. So there are 2 areas where we try to do more than being compliant. One area is the partial shutdown. A lot of people give up once they say, oh, I don't have the gross receipt drop. I was not completely shut down. ERC, it's not worth pursuing it because such a complicated thing. But we really try to understand, is there a way for them to be qualified through partial shutdown method? And that's a gray area where we spend a lot of time with our clients, and we have qualified many businesses under partial shutdown. Restaurants are a good example. They are an essential business. Many dining restaurants were open. Even when they shut down, after they were shut down, they had like this seating capacity restriction. So they had 50% seating capacity, and we were able to qualify many of them under partial shutdown. The other area, which is a kind of gray area, is the PPP period. So in the PPP period, suppose in Q2, April, May, June, Q2 qualifies, April, May, June qualify for ERC, but in June you had PPP forgiveness. Then a lot of businesses and payroll systems will just say, let's just black out June and let's not use that for ERC. But there's lots of things which are not covered by PPP. Just one example would be your high wage employees, people who are making more than 100K in a year, but that can be covered by ERC. So we spend a significant amount of our time in figuring out what dollars can we qualify ERC for, even if it is covered by PPP. And there are many other examples, but for this group, I'll just keep at those 2, and I'm happy to answer questions if you have. If you have questions, I can answer now, or we can go into specific examples. Okay, so the industries that Steve showed earlier. So here are some examples of, from those industries. I've highlighted a couple. So first of all, you notice across the board in 2020, ERC amounts are lower than 2021. Not only was the qualification easier, meaning for larger employers, who have, many of them were disqualified in 2020 because they had more full-time employees and they qualified in 2021, but also it was more lucrative. Instead of having a cap of 5K per employee for the entire year, it was 7K per employee per quarter in 2021. So you'll see 2021 ERC amounts are much higher. The next thing I wanted to bring up here is, when we're talking about essential businesses earlier in the presentation, the ones highlighted in blue are essential businesses. The first one is really restaurants for us. Restaurants were considered essential businesses, but as you can see, a lot of them qualified, and they were a big portion of our people who got ERC from our book. Similarly, healthcare and social assistance, really it means for us dentists and medical officers. Many of them qualified under partial shutdown, and I'll go through one example. So a lot of refund to them. Then I want to kind of point out that in the red, the amount is kind of lower, and in the green highlighted one higher, and that just is the industry. So the red one is, like theaters and all that, where you have a lot of part-time employees, wages are lower generally. And when you go to technical companies, IT engineering companies, the wages are higher. So you will see, in 2020, the wage per employee, I'm looking at the third column, is $4,000 for the technical company. And for the arts entertainment, it's just $2,000. So it's just double. In 2021, it grows to 6.6 K for arts, and it's $10,000 for the technical company. So in general, depending on industry, the refunds per employee are higher where the wages are higher. Happy to answer questions, or we can move to the next slide. Okay, so there we have taken 3 examples. First one is from the professional company. So I wanted to kind of mention, if you compare just the PPP in the top box to the ERC amount, you will see in 2020 it's roughly half. The ERC is half of PPP. But when you look at 2021, ERC is much higher than forgiven PPP. It's 180K versus the 102 in PPP. So that's one thing. And if you look at what they have applied to wages, forgiven PPP applied to wages, in 2020 it was 82%. 2021 it was 100% applied to wages. Theoretically, they had a chance to go down to 60% applied to wages. And if they had done that, the ERC credit could have been even higher. Although if you look at per employee, they were approaching the max, 5K per employee in 2020 and 21K per employee in 2021. So that is in this professional example. We did qualify them for partial shutdown in 2020, and in 2021 they qualified outright on basis of gross receipt in Q2 and Q3, and in Q1 we had to use the alternative period, which Joan had mentioned. There's an allowance that IRS gives you that if you don't qualify in a particular quarter outright based on gross receipt, you might still use the preceding quarter to qualify for that. So we used that, and we got them, a significant amount of ERC refund.
If I could just chime in here. So whenever people start talking about ERC, I mean, one of the key messages I'm sure you're taking away is, oh my God, it's really complicated. And the actual credit amount depends on a lot of variables, right? Which is why it does take some effort. And we're trying to advocate that employers take the effort, because the dollars as shown here can be substantial. I think one of the really important points that this example shows is the it depends and the list of variables that Joan and Iqbal have been walking you through. This example is of high wage earners, right? So think engineering, professional, technical type positions that are high pay scales. And that's why they're paying out at such a high amount, right? So remember the cap for 2020 was $5,000 per employee, and they're almost there at $4,700 per employee. And the cap for 2021 is effectively $21,000 per employee, and they're almost there at $18,000. And again, it's because they paid their people high wages, right? In the next example, you'll see that it's an industry where they're low wage earners, and so therefore the dollars play out differently on a per employee basis. Yeah.
Okay, next slide, please. So this is entertainment company. They do events, and if you see, in this case, as low mid wage earners, in 2020 they did not qualify, and that was because if you look at the employee count, it is high, and they met the full-time employee count of 100 threshold, so they did not qualify at all. They had significant PPP, and much of that was forgiven. In 2021, they also have had PPP2, $1.6 million was forgiven, 100% was applied to wages. They also, on top of that, they had the shuttered venue grant. So they got $7.2 million, and that is for 2021 and 2022 to exhaust that. But in spite of all that, they got $3 million in credit, $11,000 per employee. You can see that the ERC amount is nearly double of the PPP amount, although PPP amount itself was very significant for them in 2021. Anything you want to add, Steve? Okay. Next example, please. The last one is dental office. This is an example where they did not qualify in 2021, neither on gross receipt basis or shutdown basis. Dental office is an essential business. So in 2020, they did not qualify either on gross receipt basis or full shutdown. But we looked at their kind of floor charts, and social distancing was in effect. That was a government order, and they had to rearrange their dental chairs for having the minimum 6 feet between two chairs and all that. And when we looked at that floor plan, and then we look at the production, so we saw that their the rate at which they were seeing the patients, that had reduced. So even though there was not significant drop in revenue, we were able to qualify them under partial shutdown on that basis. And for their size of 7 employees, they got a significant credit, $27,000 and then almost $4,000 per employee. Any questions? I think that was the last slide for me.
Okay, thank you, Iqbal and Joan. So Taylor, why don't we go forward 2 slides? And we're at time. So thanks I know this got really technical, so thanks everybody for hanging in there with us. I'm not gonna go through this. This is basically just our recommendation that if you're interested in pursuing this for your organization and or any of the organizations that we know you guys coach and counsel and give advice to, we'll leave this with Taylor and Miles to send around. This is kind of the cheat sheet for what to look for in a good provider and how to make sure that they're really doing the hard work on your behalf to make sure that they're qualifying you based on the truth and of the law, and not based on misperceptions of the law, which we're running into an awful lot. There are also a number of mainland outfits that are doing all this online, and they're promising, hey, just upload, all your documents and we'll take care of it. And you've probably gotten a sense of it depends on so many things and so many regulations and orders that were unique to Hawaii, the state, and also Hawaii Island from the mayor's orders. So there's just a lot of reasons why you kind of have to shop around to find your provider. If you're interested, or anybody you know is, we're happy to help them find the right provider. ProService only processes these for existing clients. Acuity is processing and accepting for non-clients also. We both have very established ERC programs, but if not us, we can help you find another local provider who really knows what they're doing. Okay, lastly, I'd like to hand this over to Chris to give a shout out and an invitation for next week. So Taylor, let's go to the next slide.
Hey guys, so we are going to be hosting a Pauhana next week, Wednesday at Jackie Ray's. 4:30 to 6:30. There's not going to be any planned agenda or presentation, but just an opportunity for you to come meet a couple of us on the team, chat it up, have a Long Island iced tea, and enjoy each other's company. So if you are free, then come on down.
We're bringing back in-person events. So for those of you that are interested and just want to have some in-person human contact, come out and join us. And with that, we're at time. So Miles and Taylor, we think we'll hand it back to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Steve, Joan, Iqbal, and Chris. We really appreciate the time and the energy you put into this. There's definitely a lot of information. So you said you were going to be able, Steve, you're going to be able to share those slides with Miles so we can forward that on. Okay, fantastic. Because I was writing it down, and I must say, even as a former engineer, I started getting a little confused after a while. So I appreciate that. Yeah, so we're done for the day. September 8th is our next meeting, second Thursday. If you guys have anything, again, that you're interested in pursuing or speakers you'd like to hear, please let me or Miles know. Anybody else need anything or any questions before we sign off?
Just want to double check, Taylor, you'll have this recording available in a week or so, yeah? Okay.
Great. Thank you guys also very much. It's been fantastic, and thank you everybody for coming. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank
So
Thank you,
you.
guys.
Aloha.